Welcome into the latest episode of the 5 Reasons Podcast. I'm Ethan Skolnick here, as always, with Chris Whittingham. Now that you've found us, make sure you hit the subscribe or follow button on your favorite podcast provider. Get all of our old episodes. We're about 193 right now, I think, or something close to that, right? I'm very close.
Yeah, I think today is 193.
193, very close to 200. So we've got a bunch of episodes, and a lot of them still apply, actually. You know, some of them were tied to the events of the moment, but some of them Heat Stories episodes, other episodes where we took a longer view of things. Certainly worth catching up to. Also, check out our website, 5reasonsports.com. That's spelled out, not like our Twitter address. It's 5, F-I-V-E, reasonsports.com. New pieces up there today, one from Alex Toledo of Miami Heat Beat on Goran Dragic. Also, our Adam Smoot of Ballscast pissed a bunch of people off by picking apart the Avengers, so make sure you check that out as well. We do culture there as well as sports. All right, we're going to stay with Josh Rosen today a little bit, kind of. We'll deviate somewhat from what we've been doing of late, but we're going to talk quarterbacks as it relates to the Dolphins. And this was actually a piece I was thinking of writing for 5reasonsports.com. I figured let's hash it out here on a podcast and decide whether or not it's worth writing for the site, which is this question, Chris. When we've talked to Chris Kaufman, CK Parrott from 3 Yards Per Carry, Alfredo Arteaga, Uptown Report, Simon Clancy, and others, their big concern about the Dolphins this year, and I know you share this concern, is that they win too many games, that either Ryan Fitzpatrick or now Josh Rosen is too good to tank, that you're not going to end up in a situation when you win only 2 or 3 games, and therefore you take yourself out of the Tua from Herbert sweepstakes and all the other quarterbacks that are going to be available. So what we're going to break down today is a little bit unconventional, is which teams have a chance to be worse than the Dolphins? Who could potentially move ahead of them, or I should say behind them, so that they get a higher draft pick? And also, which of those teams and which other teams need quarterbacks? So we're going to break this down a few different ways, Chris, and I think we're going to start with just the teams that could potentially be in the bottom 5 of the league, which means the top 5 of the draft. So before we get into other teams that may need quarterbacks, let's look at some teams. And which teams have you identified that could be that bad?
So I'm going sort of in reverse order by the Super Bowl odds from our friends over at BetDSI.com. You look at the bottom of those rankings, the Dolphins are 94-1 to win the Super Bowl, which seems like odds that are frankly too lenient in their direction. But there are only 2 teams with worse odds than them, and they are the Buffalo Bills, who are 100-1 to win the Super Bowl, and then you have Washington, who are 100-1 as well to win the Super Bowl. So there are the only 2 teams with worse odds, and you look at their recent draft history, it's first-round pick a year ago. For Washington, it's first-round pick this year, and the guy that Daniel Snyder seems to be really in on. And that, by the way, is something that I think we should cover a fair bit on this podcast, is not just which teams do we believe to have quarterbacks, it's which teams have owners that would think that they need to change at quarterback. Because I do think that Daniel Snyder backing Dwayne Haskins is a big deal in considering what Washington is going to do. I would imagine Arizona's owner was consulted on that decision, and maybe he wanted Kyler Murray along with the rest of that front office. Because you read some of these stories and you realize how big of a decision factor the owners are, as it is in this case, as it is with Stephen Ross and the Miami Dolphins. He clearly has been telling people he wants Tua. He wants Tua. And so I'm kind of curious how that plays out. But you look at the teams below them. Buffalo, I mean, unless Josh Allen is a catastrophe, unless Washington with Dwayne Haskins is a complete disaster, I would say the Giants are probably in this conversation as well, given what they just did in the draft. But if Gettleman's still the GM in a year's time, I don't think that he, after particularly as publicly as he's defended this, that he's going to go back and draft Daniel Jones' replacement the next year. So there are a few teams that I would say are clear-cut favorites to pit Miami for this pick. I would put Tampa pretty high up there because I think Bruce Arians was brought in to fix Jameis. But if it doesn't work out in a year, you'd imagine they're looking. I'd imagine Oakland. Can you imagine if they ended up with a number 1 pick a year in which they're moving into their Vegas stadium? I'd imagine they'd very much like the idea of being able to pull that off. Cincinnati as well, just because they've been on the Andy Dalton thing for a long time. Maybe Tennessee, if it goes poorly with Marcus Mariota. I can't see them being that bad. But I would say right now, Tampa, Oakland, maybe even Denver if it goes that poorly, but I don't think it will. Oakland, Tampa, Detroit, and Cincinnati, just because they've been on the roller coaster with their quarterback for so long that I think you can convince yourself to get off it at this point.
Yeah, I don't know about Detroit. I don't know if they're going to get off the Stafford train anytime soon.
His contract is very prohibitive in this regard. So if they wanted to do it next year, they'd have to. His dead cap figure is $26 million. Yeah. So yeah. I think it would have to be another year if they wanted to do that. Maybe they're in the Trevor Lawrence sweepstakes, but not the Tua.
Yeah, I mean, let's go. Look, I think one of the things we need to take into account is that Vegas isn't always right. And also, the NFL, we see division winners flip every single year except the AFC East, right? Like, the rest of them, they all change. I mean, Jacksonville, look at this past year. Jacksonville went from first to last. That happens all the time. I mean, who had Baltimore projected ahead of Pittsburgh in the AFC North this year necessarily? You look at some of the other, divisions. I mean, again, I think people thought the Giants would struggle, but Philadelphia was projected to win the NFC East. They did not. And the Bears, who picked the Bears in a division with Aaron Rodgers and the Vikings, right? The Vikings, I think their number before the year was 10.5. They went 8-7-1. Who projected that the Bears in Trubisky's first full season would win 12 games?
And even New Orleans, who we kind of implicitly trust, they've gone through some pretty significant up and downs. I don't know if there was a great deal of confidence. They had gone 11-5 a year the year before, but I don't know if there was quite this confidence that they would go 13-1 in their final 14 games.
Yeah, well, and look at Atlanta. Every year, it seems like Atlanta either wins 11 or 12, or they win 7. They won 7 this past year. So I think it is one way to do it, to look at Vegas, and I'll be out there this week, and I'll check it out myself to see where everything stands, and maybe I'll place a bet on the Dolphins at the over. Who knows? But because I keep placing bets on the over on South Florida sports teams, and I think I've lost every one. The Panthers I went over. The Heat I went over 42.5. And they didn't get there. The Dolphins I won, actually. Actually, the Dolphins were 6.5, and they got to 7. Yeah. So I did win that one. Thank you. Adam Gase is a genius. I always said that.
He's the only coach that's won you money.
Right. He's the only coach who won me money. It's terrific. And he ended up getting another job in New York. But, yeah, I think looking at Vegas is one way to do this. But the teams change so dramatically. So my approach is more to look at the quarterback situation, because you don't necessarily have to be drafting first or second or in the first or second slot to be able to get up to first or second, right? You could get up there from somewhere else. Now, I would assume the team that's picking first is going to take Tua, but there are potential circumstances, as you said, of teams that have committed in some way to a quarterback that even if they pick first, may not want to take the guy. It may not be like Josh Rosen and Kyler Murray, where, they had committed to Josh Rosen, but kind of still had the GM, but didn't have the same head coach, changed out the whole rest of the coaching staff. And so they decided to replace him. And they had a guy in Kingsbury they were bringing in who was basically brought in to coach Kyler Murray to a large degree. I don't know that necessarily happens next year. And so I almost look at it more from the quarterback perspective, right? So you've gone through a lot of this. Let's look at what teams would take a quarterback like that if they could, right? So AFC East, New England. If Belichick got up to number 1, he'd probably take Tua. That's my guess. I think Nick
Can we
would
go ahead
probably
and
tell him
safely
that's a good
project
idea.
that New England's not going to be there?
Yeah, I think so. But maybe they could trade their draft assets for the next 12 years. Who knows? How many draft picks have they accumulated? Like what the Dolphins are doing now is what New England's always done all these years, where they get all these extra picks. But yeah, we're going to assume Tua is not going to be the successor to Brady, right? Probably not going to happen. Looks like it might be Jarrett Stidham. We'll see. Unless Brady plays another 10 years, and then you've got to trade Stidham for a second-round pick at some stage after he fills in for Brady for one game because Brady gets suspended by the commissioner or something. All right, Buffalo, as you mentioned, Josh Allen. I think the only way that they would walk away from Josh Allen is if the whole front office turns over again, which has happened many times in Buffalo over the past few years. It's possible that after 2 years they could look at Josh Allen and say he's just not accurate enough, right? He did other things last year. He destroyed the Dolphins with his legs, but there was a lot of dispute about Josh Allen before the draft, more so than any of the other quarterbacks, more so than Josh Rosen, to be honest. There was more of a consensus about Josh Rosen. Maybe people didn't think his upside would be as high as Josh Allen's, but there was more of a consensus that he was an NFL quarterback than there was about Josh Allen. It's possible if Buffalo gets to number 1 or number 2 or somewhere in there, that whoever it is that's running the show up there, maybe McDermott's not the coach anymore, decides Josh Allen isn't the guy. So I think that's possible. The Jets, I feel, am I wrong about this? I feel like they're more committed to their guy, to Darnold, than maybe the Bills are to Allen. Is that wrong?
Yeah, I think because you have the examples of him playing well passing in games that you just don't have from Josh Allen in year one. I mean, all the games where he was spectacular were games that he ran. He ran for 100 yards in multiple games last year, including against Miami, and those were impressive displays, but you can genuinely see, and I think Baltimore would be kind of in this category as well, because Lamar Jackson, again, they're going to win enough games that they're not going to be in this conversation, but Lamar Jackson did so little to impress you with his arm. It was all with his legs that you might consider, this is not a sustainable model for success. So yeah, I think with Adam Gase now taking over, and probably taking the job, at least in part because he wants to do something with Sam Darnold, we definitely know he will be headstrong about quarterbacks. But at the same time, I think because you've seen Sam Darnold do it through the air, that leads you to believe that they have more confidence in making Darnold work. But again, I do think all these things do kind of go out the window. If you're picking one, that means it was such a disaster, or the player got hurt in a significant way that it wrecked your season. So either way, I do think that it's possible. Again, we just saw it with Josh Rosen for a prospect that we do not believe to be nearly as good as Tua Tagovailoa and Kyler Murray, that they can make that switch in a year if they're convinced enough about the guy at number one. But I do think that in terms of if you're saying solidity in their thoughts, I would say definitely Darnold over Allen at this point.
All right, so AFC North, you mentioned Baltimore. If they got to number one, I do think they would absolutely consider it. I don't know that they're committed in any way to Lamar Jackson other than the fact that he outplayed Flacco last year and they started to win with him. Like you said, I mean, he didn't do much with his arm at all, and we saw in the playoff game where the first three quarters, I mean, he was horrific. Now the fourth quarter he made some plays, and I don't like giving up on a guy that early, just because we don't see all of it, but there were reasons Lamar Jackson slipped, and some of those issues with accuracy and some of the other things that he might deal with throwing, and we'll see if that changes. But in the AFC North, they just gave Roethlisberger 2 more years. And I don't see, although I think at some point, like you keep hemorrhaging talent, like the Steelers hemorrhage talent, at some point it has to affect you, right? And so I don't know how good they're going to be this year.
They've always regenerated, though. They've always regenerated.
They have, but have they lost 2 guys? And I know they didn't have Bell last year, and they obviously got had a really good season from Connor filling in anyway, and he reproduced a lot of Bell's yardage. But if they lost 2 guys like that in the same offseason, like yes, they've lost a ton of guys. Okay, Joey Porter to Miami, Mike Wallace to Miami, Lawrence Timmons to Miami. A lot of different players they've lost over the years to different teams. Seems like a lot of them were Miami, and none of them worked out here except for Joey Porter for 1 year. But I don't know. It feels like a lot, but I always say that Mike Tomlin figures out a way to win 9 or 10 games or 11 games, and then the fans still kill him anyway for some decision. But I don't think Pittsburgh's going to be in that position. If Cleveland's in that position, Baker got hurt, right? Yeah. That's the only way. The only way that they would draft Tua number 1 overall is if Baker had a career-ending injury, because they're not going to be worse than the draft. I think they're an 11-win team this year.
I agree.
They're not going to be. They're not going to be the worst team in the league. And again, if they are, it's only because Baker's hurt. Since he's the interesting one, it's a totally different regime. Finally, right? Mike Brown's still there, but Marvin controlled things for 15 years. And Dalton has had. Dalton is the new Tannehill, right?
Without question,
right? He's exceedingly average.
And
the only
actually,
difference is he's made the playoffs.
And right now in his contract, he's actually on a debt-free contract. So if they wanted to cut him, they can cut him for nothing. Now, I'd imagine maybe they'd restructure. I don't know if they'd restructure because they might be in a good cap position. But he's in the 6th year, or I'm sorry, the 5th year of a 6-year extension, and he doesn't have any more bonuses or anything like that left. So that contract is paid for. So I think Cincinnati is probably. But the thing for me is that they're too good. They have too good of a roster. Last year, when Dalton got hurt, their season tailspin. But if he's healthy, I think he's too good. And if A.J. Green stays healthy, they're definitely too good to be this bad. Like, A.J. Green would have to get hurt again, which is definitely possible. He's had a lot of injury-plagued seasons. But to be as bad as we're talking about, I think Cincinnati has too many good players to do that.
Yeah, but we keep saying that, and do they still? Like, I don't know. I mean, they have, right? But I don't know. I look at the roster now, and it's not the same roster that it was. I mean, they had some dominant players on defense. Whether and obviously AJ Green's terrific, but I don't know. I don't feel like it's the same quality that they've had in past years. Like they could bottom out. Like when that thing fell apart last year, it really fell apart.
Yeah,
Plus, they hired a head coach with like virtually no experience, and I don't understand what his pedigree is. I mean, when he was here with Miami, I didn't think. I mean, who thought much of Zach Taylor? Like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it was, to me, there were some weird hires this offseason. That one, like, they identified him early and like went straight for him, and I didn't really completely understand.
And waited for him too. Waited for him to be done with the Super Bowl, and then bring him in. When I point to their talent, I'm mainly pointing to Joe Mixon, who I think is really solid at running back. AJ Green, who I think who might be the player, the non-quarterback in the league that most swings his team. When AJ Green is healthy, Cincinnati is really good, and when he doesn't, they are horrific. And their quarterback is horrific when he doesn't play. And then Geno Atkins up front. Like, I think a defense that has Geno Atkins in it is enough to sustain. I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about their other talent. I mean, they still have Dre Kirkpatrick out there. They have Carlos Dunlap, but I think Geno Atkins is a good enough defensive player to justify Cincinnati as a good defensive team and a decent roster. We'll get back to today's episode in a second, but first I want to tell you about one of our new sponsors here in the 5 Reasons Sports Network, and that is the attorneys at Seltzer Mayberg. Find them at onecalllegal.com. That's O-N-E, calllegal.com, or actually call 855 5000 Law LAW. They handle cases including but not limited to car accidents, slip and falls, and any personal injury matters. Additionally, if you mention 5 Reasons, they will handle your traffic ticket for $44.99 with a new 15,000 square foot office opening on I-95 in North Miami. They will handle cases all over South Florida. Call now with 24/7 service for a free consultation. OneCallLegal.com or 855-5000 Law. The attorneys at Seltzer Mayberg, a proud sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network.
All right, let's look at the AFC South. Houston's not going to be that bad, and they're not looking to replace their quarterback. The same with the Colts. I mean, unless Luck had a career-ending injury. Tennessee's interesting. A lot of people think they had a really good draft. Actually, they've got our boy Tannehill now. And I don't know how committed they are to Mariota. I really don't. He seems to struggle to stay healthy. I mean, that's been a consistent theme with him. You see it from him some games, and then not in others. Like, it would not surprise me at all if Ryan ends up starting close to half the games this season, either due to injury or performance. And so, but I don't see them dropping that far. Jacksonville's another one. I mean, Nick Foles, who I have enormous respect for what he did in Philadelphia. But he's had a couple of opportunities in other places, and it hasn't worked out. Mm-hmm. And, it feels a little Case Keenum to me, like kind of what happened where Case Keenum went to Denver, and it was like, maybe he's not the guy he was in Minnesota. Could the Jags be that bad? Because I didn't think they could be an 11-loss team last year with that defense. I know they had a lot of injuries, but could they be bad enough to get in the bottom 3 or 4?
I would say it's possible offensively, and particularly in the passing game, because they don't have any receivers. I mean, you look at their receiving depth chart; it is threadbare. There's nobody on that team. Their 2 deep is Dede Westbrook, Marquise Lee, Chris Conley, and DJ Clark. Keelan Cole, who is a player that you heard of for like one fantasy game. They don't have any talent at that receiver position. They're trying to make do at tight end. I mean, it's really only Leonard Fournette. They could have an appalling offense again. I just think that from a defensive standpoint, I know they went 5-11 this past year, but I think Blake Bortles was bad enough. I mean, they only scored 245 points last year. I mean, that is an appalling figure, and still had, they're the second worst offense in the NFL, ahead of only Arizona. They still had the fifth best defense by points allowed last year. Their defense is still really good, and I think the upgrade from Foles to Bortles can be enough that they at least become a below-average offense. Like, a below-average offense would be good enough to get that team to 7 or 8 wins with as good as that defense is. Now, the one thing that could happen is that you did start to see signs that as impenetrable as that defense was in 2017, there were some holes, there were some opportunities, and some of that is probably just you're going to put that defense out on the field enough, and they're going to give up points just because how could you possibly snuff out an opposition for 13 possessions a game? But at the same time, there were some holes there, and you do see that defensive cores are difficult to sustain because bodies break, and it's just not the same in year 3 as it is in year 1. But at the same time, I just think that the upgrade, like they still upgraded at quarterback, even if you think that Case Keenum going to Denver, and we've seen a few Sam Bradford going to Arizona again. Sam Bradford getting contracts, but I still think that even as bad as Foles has been at times in regular seasons with Los Angeles, although, let's be honest, Jeff Fisher was his coach, as bad as he was at times in Los Angeles, even as bad as he was at times in Philly when he was given the full-time starter's job, it's enough of an upgrade for me over Bortles, who for me is a terrible quarterback, that I think they can upgrade from where they were at 5-11. I don't consider them as a downward team.
All right, let's look at the AFC West here. Let's skip over the Chiefs. Let's skip over the Chargers. Let's skip over the Chargers too. Although obviously, look, they need to find a replacement for Rivers, but it's not going to be Tua. I mean that's a really good team, and I think they got better this offseason. So they're not going to be in that position, and I don't think they're going to have the ammunition to move up. You mentioned Denver. I think the teams in this division are interesting. Denver. I mean, John Elway. This whole thing about him being a quarterback guru. I mean, it's been ugly. I mean, The Paxton Lynch drafting. I mean, I'm not going to blame him for Trevor Siemian. I mean, that was a late round pick. I mean, they took a flyer on him. But the Osweiler thing, which thankfully they didn't pay him. Manning, obviously they got out of him what they could, and then he broke down his last season, but they still won the Super Bowl. But the Keenum thing did not work out. Now they've gone a totally different direction this year. Their defense, you talk about a defense, I feel like what happened to them is kind of what happened to Jacksonville, where, I mean, they still have really good players in that defense. It's not as deep as it was before, but I just think they broke down last year because it just got to the point where, first thing, obviously I don't think Vance Joseph did a great job out there, but, they were minus 20 point differential. So they were actually closer to an 8-8 team than the 6-10 that they finished, losing their last 4 games of the season. They were actually in the playoff race at one point, but I don't know. I feel like they've lost a lot of guys. He still hasn't solved the quarterback situation. He clearly would take, a top guy if he got into the top 5 or 6. So I do think they're a threat to the Dolphins.
Again, though, I do think that they upgraded a quarterback. And as bad as Joe Flacco was at times last year, and look, he might just be done. I mean, it's entirely possible. But I don't think they'd have too much issue getting off of his contract if they absolutely had to. And I think that Joe Flacco is an eminently replaceable quarterback. I will say, though, they did just trade up to go get Drew Lock in this draft. So I think that he's a quarterback that maybe could be considered that guy. But again, if he shows no signs, and if they're terrible, I absolutely think, I mean, the question is, do you think they can be that level of terrible? And I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. They obviously had a down year a year ago, though their point differential, we talk about point differential all year long. Just compare this with the Dolphins. So Denver goes 6-10, has a point differential of minus 20. The Dolphins go 7-9 and have a point differential of minus 114. So they almost had about 100 points worth of point difference separating them, yet Miami finishes with a better record. So if you're going off of that, and maybe Joe Flacco offering the proposition of improvement, maybe that regresses to the mean a year from now, and I think that Denver could potentially be due for an up year just by virtue of that figure. Maybe the quarterback is that difference in them being 8-8 as opposed to, I mean, that's the point differential of an 8-8 team, and so maybe they improve. But I think Denver has a possibility to go on the slide. The one thing, though, is that you definitely know that John Elway does not think that way. He does not think about, taking steps back. He's a constantly win now type of general manager. So I would not anticipate that Denver will be hoping for this to happen. Maybe the upgrade in coaching, but I generally think that Denver is not a terribly impressive team at the moment.
Yeah, I don't think they are either, and neither is Oakland. And,
right.
You talk about point differential, minus 177 last year.
Oof.
I mean, they should have been worse than 4-12. And, they had a ton of picks this year, and so they've accumulated, a lot more players, and he's building the base up there. But it's never felt like John Gruden really wanted Derek Carr. It doesn't feel kind of like that's a marriage that's going to last. The only thing with Gruden is that he typically likes veteran guys anyway. Like I thought one of the great myths with Gruden is that, the whole quarterback school thing, that like he was going to develop a quarterback. What quarterback has John Gruden developed other than Brett Favre? And did he develop Brett Favre in Green Bay,
or was he on the staff himself? Was he on the staff as Favre was being developed by maybe other coaches?
Right, or himself, right? Like, Brett Favre is not the most mechanically sound quarterback who's ever played, right? He was a gunslinger, essentially. I mean, he was, he's not Rodgers, okay, in terms of the way that he approached the position. He was great, but he was a different kind of great. So that's the question I have is, like, of course, Gruden would take Tua. Mike Mayock is there now, too, and obviously Mayock is a draft guy. I don't know that he's spoken publicly about Tua or any of the other quarterbacks like he used to when he was working for NFL Network. But Oakland is a threat to Miami. There's no question.
Right. I'm looking right now. I just went to their website just to see where they are in their projected date. They're due to open that stadium in 2020, and I'm looking at a picture of it now. I mean, a lot of the architecture has gone up, and that construction is well underway. Can you imagine a billboard in Vegas? Come watch Tua with Antonio Brown. I guess the one thing that probably takes them out of this conversation would be they just drafted 3 players in the first round, although obviously they took some criticism over their choices. But they just took 3 players in the first round. They traded for Antonio Brown. Do we think this is a team that's not going to improve? If there's
they
a team,
have so far to go, though. That's
sure.
Look. They gave up 467 points last year.
I think that's worse than the league. If it's not worse, then it's close.
I think it's 12 points worse than Cincinnati. It's worse than the Jets.
It's worse than the league, and Tampa was second worst at 464. But they gave it the most points in the league last year.
Yeah, so they're a definite threat. So I think we come out of the AFC and we say, just on paper, and so much of this changes, but I think it's Oakland 1 and Cincinnati 2.
They're trying to sell personal seat licenses. They're trying to do a lot of things that they need in order to make this. I mean, Mark Davis, the owner of the Raiders, is not a very rich man, which seems absurd to say, but he's putting a lot of money into this stadium, getting a lot of it financed. He needs this to work. And if you can put Tua and Antonio Brown on a billboard in Las Vegas, that will work. And I think from opening up a stadium and trying to start a new project in a new city, I can't think of a better way than Tua in Las Vegas to really get that thing going. I'm now in talking through this, I'm now most fearful of the Raiders, actually.
We'll get back to our episode here in a second, but first I want to tell you about a great new sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network, and that is ShipYourCarNow.com. These guys can move any car, boat, RV, motorcycle, or equipment anywhere you need worldwide. You have a business and need to ship freight or machinery? Call them. College moves, new car, used car, buying the toy you've looked at for a while? Call them. These guys can ship it all, so give them a call. Here's the number, 1-800-264-4644. That's 1-800-264-4644, or visit shipyourcarnow.com/5 reasons. Also, make sure to mention 5 reasons on the phone. I wish they'd had this when I was going to college. This would have been great for me. I needed to get my car down from Baltimore to Florida. I ended up taking the auto train. You don't want to take the auto train. Ship your car, fly. No job too big or too small. Ship Your Car Now moves it all. I don't think it's Dallas. I don't think that. I mean, there's too much talent on that team still to completely bottom out. I mean, unless Ezekiel Elliott misses the whole season, I think they would replace Dak Prescott. I don't see them as long-term committed to Prescott. Cowboy fans are split on him still. Of course, Cowboy fans were split on Romo also. And, I think a lot of them would take Tony back now and appreciate him a little bit more. Philadelphia is not going to be that bad. Too much talent on that roster. I mean, that was the most beat up team. For all that Adam Gase complained last year, Philadelphia was the most beat up team in the league. They still won 9 games. And, provided that Wentz is reasonably healthy, it's not going to happen. Washington and the Giants, you mentioned both. If Daniel Jones is awful this year, remember, everything accelerates in New York, right?
Sure.
And so if Daniel Jones is awful, then Gettleman could get bounced. And if that happens and they win 3 games, you think a new general manager in New York is not going to take one of these premium quarterbacks?
Oh, my God. Couldn't happen fast enough. You talk about, billboards, Tua in New York. I mean.
Yeah. That would absolutely happen. So the Giants are a threat. Even the Daniel Jones thing means nothing to me. They're still a threat. The Redskins are a threat, but I don't know. I mean, look, Alex Smith gave them competent quarterback play last year, and they won 7. That's not it's really not a terrible defensive roster, though. They're pretty good defensively, which is going to keep them in a lot of games. I can see them as a 5-11. Again, but they just drafted Haskins. Dan Snyder always goes for the biggest guy, so they probably would take him, but I don't think they're going to be bad enough. And NFC North. Chicago's not going to be bad enough. Minnesota's not going to be bad enough. That's a really talented roster. I thought they underachieved last year at 8-7-1, and obviously they've got a ton of money tied up in Kirk Cousins.
That's a fully guaranteed contract for this season and next season. I mean, how could you possibly get rid of that?
Not happening. Green Bay. The only way it happens is if Aaron gets hurt in game 1, right? Like that's it. And
which could very well happen. I mean, it could be the Peyton Manning season. I will say, though, I believe Green Bay either did or is in the process of giving him a pretty significant contract extension. So I don't know. I mean, I'd imagine you could find a trade partner for Aaron Rodgers if he has a season-ending injury in Week 1, but that would probably be very difficult to pull off. And maybe you draft him as the replacement and give Tua the Aaron Rodgers treatment. But yeah, I mean, that's well within the realm of possibilities that there's a season-ending injury for Rodgers and they take him at 1.
Yeah, but it has to be in the first 3 or 4 games because Aaron's going to win you a couple games and take you out of that. Detroit, you mentioned. I mean, Stafford. It's, they've been riding this train. I didn't realize they were 6-10 last year. I thought they were a little better than that. I feel like they've been 8-8, 9-7 forever. Would they? Probably. I mean, how many years has Stafford been there now? He's got to be in terms of, he's obviously not Rivers or Brady or Roethlisberger tenure, but he's there with Andy Dalton, isn't he?
He's been there since 2009.
Yeah.
He's been there. This is his 11th season with the Detroit Lions. I mean, that's a ludicrous amount of football that has produced little to no winning. I mean, Matthew Stafford is the Marvin Lewis of quarterbacks, just there all the time, despite never winning a single thing and never even, again, this is the measurement, and people get on me about this when it comes to the Heat, that I don't enjoy the games enough. And look, I think I will admit that I enjoyed the games more than I thought I would. But for me, you measure a team's sort of position in the marketplace as, do they go into the season with a chance of winning the championship? And Detroit, with Matthew Stafford at quarterback, has never felt going into a year that they could win the championship. And to me, it's incredible that they're entering their 11th season with this quarterback without ever feeling that way, and they keep again and again renewing and signing up for it. I think that, again, I said earlier that the contract is tricky, but this could be a team on the slide, and maybe they just eat that contract or figure out a way to trade it or do something with it. But I think that if Detroit was bad enough, and I think that they could be. Patricia has definitely shown signs that he's a difficult character to work with, and he could be a McDaniels, with season and a half and flame out. But I think Detroit is in this conversation. The Stafford contract, though, would probably be the only thing that would give me heart as a Dolphins fan, looking at them as the prospect of getting that number 1 pick.
How much better has Matthew Stafford been than Ryan Tannehill was?
I would say on the high end of Matthew Stafford, when he was putting up the seasons with Calvin Johnson, I mean, his numbers in some of those seasons are absurd. They just never had a team that, or even when it got time for him to win games, it never really felt. I mean, but he had a 5,000-yard season with 41 touchdowns in his third year. The following season, 4,967. I mean, at his high end, when he was, working with Calvin Johnson, they put up numbers. Like, he was a great fantasy quarterback. But again, you just never really felt going into a year that you were going to win with him in a big way. But I do think at the high end, in terms of the production and in terms of the excitement, I think it's probably been better. But in terms of overall winning, I don't think it's that big of a difference. On his career, Matt Stafford as a quarterback is 66-75, and even including the fact that he went 3-10 in his first 2 seasons, had a 4-12 season in his fourth. The last few years have been hovering right around 500. He is pretty Tannehill-y, especially in these last few years, as he's been kind of taken out of that risk-taking mode by Jim Bob Cooter.
We'll get back to our episode here in a second, but first, we've had a lot of inquiries about how you can contribute to the 5 Reasons Sports Network, other than just giving us money, which we'll certainly take, or being a podcaster, and I have too many bad ones already. So here's an idea if you want to get involved with us, and it goes beyond our new website, 5reasonsports.com. We are looking for sales representatives. Why? Because we have a lot to sell. We sell ads on our podcasts. We sell ads on social media. We also are selling sponsorships and banner ads on our website. So we got a ton of inventory to sell. We are credentialed with all 5 teams down here. We're fully established, and we just want somebody who can go out into the community and sell that product, sell Miami sports by Miami for Miami to the South Florida community. So if you want to get involved, here's 2 ways that you can contact us. One is by going to Skolnick at 5reasonsports.com, and the other way is going to Jorge, Jorge, at 5reasonsports.com. Reach out one of those 2 ways, and we will get back in touch with you and tell you how you can help and how you can make money. All right, let's go to the NFC South. The Saints won't be bad enough. It's not going to happen. Too much talent. I mean,
if Breeze, again, that's a day 1 injury, where if Breeze, this is the year that it all collapses.
But they have a backup that's okay, right? Like, I mean,
Bridgewater.
They're going to go 3-13 with Bridgewater with that roster.
Yeah, that roster and that coaching staff and that system, it would be hard. It would be hard to fathom.
I don't think so. Atlanta, same thing. I mean, I don't think they're looking to replace Matt Ryan in the next couple of years. Carolina, I know how controversial Cam is, but that's also a pretty good roster.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they're looking to replace him.
They're too good.
You identified Tampa. I think there's a real possibility there. I think the thing about Bruce Arians is Bruce Arians has the credibility to be able to say, yeah, I tried with Jameis, it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. In a way that Adam Gase did not with Ryan Tannehill, right?
Especially when he took the job under the auspices of, I'm taking this job so I can work with Jameis. So if that's the narrative you create at the beginning, when you decide to abandon ship in a year's time, you have the credibility of having said that.
Right. And so I really think there's a real possibility here that they give up on Jameis. I mean, they took Fitzpatrick out of the way this year. They've handed the job back to Jameis. And if they're bad again, now they put up a ton of points last year. I mean, that really wasn't the problem, right? They put up almost 400 points, and they couldn't defend at all.
It was more that they turned the ball over too much too. I think that plays a big role. But the thing is that Bruce Arians doesn't discourage turnovers. He's also he's kind of the most in a league of coaches where they think that their job is to engineer quarterback play out of minimizing risk. Bruce Arians is exactly the opposite, and so I think Jameis Winston is probably going to throw a similar number of interceptions.
He might, and so I would put them in the mix there too. All right, go to the NFC West. Not Rams, not Seahawks. I feel like that Russell Wilson contract kind of takes them out of the running for Tua. So we get the other 2 teams. It's not going to be Arizona. I don't think they would do it again, would they?
They could. I mean, theoretically, they could blow out their front office, right? I mean, if it goes that poorly, but it would have to be a real disaster for Keim and Kingsbury to be blown out after 1 year, and you're doing this again at the top of the draft with the quarterback. But I mean, if Kyler Murray at 5'10", doesn't work, and it's a train wreck, you can see it. And I don't think you'd entirely fault Arizona, particularly having blown out the coaching staff in the front office. But I really like Kyler Murray. I think he's going to be good, and I think Cliff Kingsbury is going to figure out a way to make that work offensively and doesn't have to worry about the defense like he did at Texas Tech. He's got a group of professionals. Vance Joseph is basically going to be the head coach of the defense, and I think Arizona is probably going to be an improved team.
Yeah, so I don't think it would be them. That would be one of the craziest stories in sports if it happened again.
Yeah.
So that leaves the 49ers, and I guess it depends on how Garoppolo comes back.
Mm-hmm.
and whether he's healthy enough. Now, the way they structured that contract, from what I remember, they do have some outs out of it, right? Like, I mean, they're not totally committed to him in the way that, say, Minnesota committed to Kirk Cousins. So I could see some scenario there. But it's been sort of hard to figure out what the hell the Niners have been doing the last few years.
I didn't realize how team friendly that contract is. This year, so next year, if they wanted to get out from underneath it, it would only cost them $4.2 million. So if he's not good this year and they're not good, they can get out of that contract pretty easily. But man, the NFL runs such a scam with these contracts.
It's crazy.
I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, it's also crazy because the reporters don't make the distinction, right? So they just talk about what the money is and not the guaranteed money, which ultimately is what matters.
The top line number on Spotrac is 5 years, $137.5 million.
Right.
Like,
I mean,
wow, holy crap! And then you look at it and go, oh, they can cut him in year 3 for $4.2 million, and it's like, well, hang on a second. How valuable was this contract really?
Yeah, it's not. And so, all right, so we go through it. So in the NFC, we went through our top 2 in the AFC. Who would be your top 2 in the NFC?
We kind of talked ourselves into Detroit a little bit, didn't we? I would say the Giants, and would it be Detroit and probably Tampa? I'd say Detroit. I'd say the Giants and Tampa are my top 2. With San Francisco.
I think
maybe Washington right around there, because if Washington's truly a tire fire, they could be there. And Detroit. If it goes that poorly in Detroit, I think they figure out a way to get off of Stafford, maybe trade him to another team, and then take Tua. So I would make that my top 3 with the Giants and Tampa the top 2.
So we're really talking about 7 teams or so, and so if that's all it is, I guess scrolling this back to the Dolphins, if they could potentially be. Knowing their luck, they'll end up with the 9th pick, right? But like, if they could be in that sort of bottom 5, how many elite quarterbacks are we talking about in this draft? Right, just off the top, because you know how guys get projected up. We talked about this before this draft, right? Nobody was saying Kyler Murray was the number 1 overall pick.
No one was saying Jones.
No one was saying Daniel Jones. So at this point, I mean, you already have, is it 3 that we're saying that are definite top 10 picks, unless something goes completely wrong for them this year?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when
Herbert and Fromm.
Yeah, I remember when Matt Barkley was one of these guys, and then he had a terrible season the next year at USC. But yeah, I mean, barring something unforeseen, you'd imagine Fromm, Herbert, and Tua are at the top.
Right. So I mean, the Dolphins are going to be in position. I mean, based on how many teams, because I just think there are too many teams that either there's just too much talent on the roster, or they just have a quarterback situation they're not going to want to get out of right away. And because the only way you can't, as an existing general manager, unless you just, like Steve Keim in Arizona, changed everything else, it's very difficult for you to be able to say, the guy we just took, I'm not feeling him anymore, right? Like, it's just, I mean, what happened in Arizona, like, that never happens. Like, that never happens. And the Dolphins may benefit from it. We'll see what goes on with Rosen, who, by the way, we didn't really get into it on this pod, but I thought handled himself extremely well the other day. It's frightening that he cares about the environment. I think that's a serious character issue, and that he studies the stock market, because, I mean, why would anybody want to actually have investments that grow? So these are serious concerns about him. I mean, similar to the Tyreek Hill concerns. I mean, right on par with them. So I'm glad that our excellent beat writers have pointed these things out. But yeah, I thought he handled himself really well. So I guess
I enjoyed as well the introspection and the self-awareness, and also the context. I think a lot of people are holding that I don't need football thing against him. And that had some important context. Like, I normally think when athletes say I was taken out of context, it's code for I screwed up, and I'm going to try, and I'm going to blame the media, because that's the thing that the people that are hearing this are kind of inclined to believe, right? I think the media get blamed for directly quoting people all the time. In this case, I do think that there was valuable context. What he's basically saying was, I was having a conversation with some teammates, and they were talking about where they came from. And I said, I don't need football because I come from a much better situation. If I decided to pursue a 4-year degree here at UCLA and go into another field, my parents could support me. My parents could figure out a way for me to enter the real world, and I could live a perfectly normal and reasonable life, and I don't need this. Whereas a lot of people who go and play college football are doing so because they need it. They need it to, to escape and to fix their family situations in a way that I think is pretty clearly told in the stories of a lot of players. We've had Jakeem Grant on this podcast talk about his story growing up and how much that's important to him. So that story has been told 1,000 times in sports. What you don't really hear the story of is, well, there's this, entitled rich kid who grew up and figured out, and kind of flaunted it a little bit. But that's not really flaunting. That's just sort of accurately depicting what his life was. And that's not nearly as inspirational a story, but it's also a correct one. I think the one thing, too, and you mentioned when he was drafted, or when he was traded for, that at the very least he'll be more interesting. I think he also regrets the fact that he was a freshman at UCLA, kind of took that in a little bit, was ready to be interesting, and I think in a Johnny Manziel kind of way, although obviously that didn't go nearly as pear-shaped, I do think that he has realized, I needn't be so interesting in public because it gets me in trouble. And I think he now recognizes with the value of experience. We've also mentioned the fact on this pod that he is older, or he's younger than some people that may surprise you. But in his older age, such that it is, he is starting to realize maybe saying interesting things and being interesting in public is not in my best interest.
I thought he handled himself really well. Maybe he is the quarterback of the future. Maybe they do win 9 games this year. Who knows? Take themselves completely out of this thing. And then in 3 years, you and everybody else are regretting it because we had that one Gus Frerotte Chad Pennington season from Josh Rosen where they caught lightning in a bottle. But I think the Dolphins have done enough to sabotage themselves, at certain positions. They have 5 defensive backs on the roster that are playable and probably maybe 1.5 offensive linemen that are playable. So he's probably going to get killed by week 7. So it's not going to matter. But I did think he handled himself well. Anyway, we'll get into more of this. I've got a couple of guests we want to bring on to talk some more Dolphins here over the next couple of weeks. Also going to get back into the NBA. Again, check out the website, 5reasonssports.com.
Thank you for listening to the 5 Reasons Podcast. Thank you so much.